way it was advertised was that this would be He-Man 2. He had a tweet where he clarified because we don't have the legal rights to the 1980s cartoon. That's actually owned by somebody else. So Mattel has the ownership rights to the toys. So they were kind of lying and saying this is going to be He-Man 2. That's not going to happen. However, they weren't being entirely deceptive because of copyright laws. Like, you can do certain things and you can't do certain things. I'll just give one example. Like, you can make a Frankenstein film because Frankenstein is in the public domain. However, you can't just do any version. If you do a certain kind of Frankenstein, you can potentially be sued by Universal. So even with a public domain property, you can be sued. So I think they're trying to ride a fine line. Now, technically, this does help out with the race swap controversy because, again, we're not really doing He-Man Part 2. So Netflix advertised it as He-Man Part 2, but that's Netflix. That had nothing to do with Kevin Smith or the producers and how they created the show. Nevertheless, there are points I think you can argue about because, again, I'm not really that concerned with this issue because the core team, Teela, He-Man, Orko, they're not really affected by this. This is about the minor characters. Nevertheless, some of the fandom does really like those characters. But I'm like, who are these characters exactly? Because I had never heard of them. So one of them, for instance, is King Grayskull. And I'm like, did I miss something? I don't remember him from the 1980s. And the answer is, no, he's from a different version. He's from a version in the early 2000s. And another character that was changed is from the comics. But is the core team being changed? And the answer is not really. But that is why Teela looks different, Orko looks different. They have to differentiate the look of the characters to avoid copyright issues. So I'm like, okay, it is disappointing because I did want He-Man 2. So that part of it, I'm like, all right. I don't like that, but at least he clarified why that's not happening and why the characters look a little bit strange. I'm sort of half and half. I do think Battle Cat and Skeletor look really good, but I would have preferred the more classical approach. But, at least he clarified why they really can't do that. It's the kind of legalities of copyright law. Nevertheless, on the race swapping, these are minor characters. And honestly, this is a separate issue from me because I'm more concerned with the 80s cartoon issue. So as long as the core team is fine, I'm not really concerned. But let's say you are a fan of those minor characters, even though they're peripheral characters. I agree, this is probably disturbing. And I guess it's sort of like a cutoff line if you think enough of the show is with the classical characters, but each person will have to decide for themselves. I would agree, though, that there is a little suspicious thing because the majority of these race swap characters are black. And you're sort of like, well, I can understand doing this thing in terms of diversity. It may just be a corporate mandate with Mattel, but why only one skin color? That seems kind of suspicious and self-contradictory. So it just feels like, okay, if you're going to do this, that's fine, but why would Eternia then just be a kind of black-white binary? That doesn't really hold up, so that seems a little suspicious. So it's a weird bit of good news from Kevin Smith, sort of admitting, well, we don't really have control over the 80s cartoon, so that's why things look so differently. I guess they could have just made that much more clear, so it's unclear if Netflix misrepresented this was He-Man 2 and Kevin Smith just allowed that misimpression, or did they coordinate things? But I think I'm going to trust Smith on this, and that's like, well, that's Netflix. They put it out that this was He-Man 2, but we did not put out that this was He-Man 2. But even so, these kind of minor changes to the characters, yes, it's not the main core team, but if you're going to do it, I think they should have just been more clear, well, what exactly is the motivation? Because it seems like it's just pandering to current day politics. Like, you can change the characters, that's fine, but it's like, but why just one skin color? That doesn't really add up, so that seems a little suspicious. And again, even though I know the cartoon pretty well, like I know Transformers, I know that comic, I even have the Transformers comic, but I didn't even know He-Man had a comic. So to me, I'm a little bit more indifferent on this because I don't know the vast majority of these characters because I didn't even know they even had a comic, honestly. So I was like, oh, okay, that's interesting. So I was a little confused, like, oh, they're changing things, because I'm like, I look at Orko and He-Man and all these other things that they didn't seem to change it all that much. But there are, of course, some changes now because of the copyright thing. So it's like, oh, it's the minor characters that are being changed. So I guess this will go to each part of the fandom. And do you want purity all the way through, or are you okay with modifications with the minor characters? Since I'm not into those minor characters, I'm kind of out of that debate. But again, if people are angry over it, well, I think that's justified because they haven't exactly been as clear as they should have been. But hopefully this is the last stumble because, yeah, at this point they've lost a lot of credibility. But we'll see what happens. Thanks for listening.